So what are the pros and cons of spamming units in Warhammer 40k, or fielding a big kaleidoscope of different options? Let's talk through some of the advantages and disadvantages, and what they mean for army construction and playing games on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking unit spam and a few of the advantages and disadvantages of, say, ranking up a whole load of dreadnoughts or tanks on one side of the table and fielding 3 of a bunch of efficient datasheets versus taking a variety of different options within the codex if they're available. This one's one of the many different choices that you can make as you're building up armies in 40k. There's plenty of reasons that people might go for ranking up lots of choices, either playing to certain unit strengths, an overall grand strategy or detachments, or just liking the way that a good themed army of, say, a whole bunch of dreadnoughts or a massive horde army looks on the table. But for this one I thought I'd mainly focus on the gameplay factors that either incentivize you to take lots of the same thing, and then the things that compete against that, and make it a good idea to take a whole bunch of different supporting units, each tailored to their battlefield role. I feel like balancing out spam and skew lists has been something that Warhammer 40k army construction has often had to contend with. In general, Games Workshop's ideal outcome is to have at least a fair mix of units on the board, allowing people to go heavy on one certain build or archetype for their army, but it not just being an I win button to take a whole load of units of just one certain profile and have that be basically unbeatable. In previous editions of the game, 40k has generally had a force organisation chart of one sort or another, maybe this classic version with 1 HQ and 2 troops and then supporting stuff from the past, and then getting more complicated over further editions with all sorts of different detachments, and then in 10th edition largely just doing away with it for the more simplistic take the units that you like, but you can only take 3 of them kind of approach that they have going on. I feel like quite a lot of people look back to this one with rose-tinted glasses. It definitely did have its advantages, but it also limit list building creativity a little bit, plus a lot of the choices that were locked out maybe tended to be a little bit arbitrary just depending on where units had been assigned in the force organisation slot, and could be annoying for certain armies to field troops if Games Workshop hadn't really given armies troops that were particularly effective and felt like a bit of a tax sometimes. In general, in 10th edition, you can have some seriously skewed armies, entire forces worth of tanks and vehicles, or taking crazy infantry hordes if you'd like to. The only thing that really limits army construction is the rule of 3, so you can have maximum of 3 of any one datasheet, going up to 6 of them for things like dedicated transports or battle line units. I remember when they initially released the rule of 3, that was in early 8th edition, to stop people doing silly things like spamming stuff like 9 Hive Tyrants or similar amounts of Ravenwing Dark Talons in a list at the time, and I felt like it was definitely a tool in helping armies look a bit more like armies again, when it was kind of clear that the game rules in themselves didn't do enough to disincentivize just taking power units and sweeping the table. It is quite nice to have a hard cap on people just spamming one datasheet, so it doesn't make sense to take an entire force of just one thing, but maybe it isn't quite as big a factor for the armies out there that have multiple similar datasheets that are all kind of efficient and fill the same battlefield role. Maybe a good example could be the Astra Militarum with things like Rogel Dawns and Rogel Dawn tank commanders. That means you can basically have an entire army that's still mostly the Rogel Dawn datasheet. Never mind if you're mixing in things like Lehman Russes as well, or perhaps the Space Marine firepower units with all their different gun tank varieties. It means that spammed units in 40k though are often ones that tend to be fielded in 3s and not more, and then relying on mission design, unit balance, terrain and the way that the game plays to incentivize people to mix things up and not just take the most efficient datasheets in 3s. In general though, in terms of building optimized armies, I'd probably consider spamming out units to be the default thing. If you're just looking at Warhammer 40k from a basic damage and defense and trying to destroy the opponent's army point of view, it will just make sense that if there's just one unit that's seen as a bit more efficient than the rest, particularly if you've got some sort of synergy with another datasheet or a detachment rule on the tabletop, then on paper it's just usually going to be a good idea to take multiple copies of that. For example, if you've just got one great gun tank in your codex, why not put 3 of them on the board as opposed to 1, and just make your army overall deadly for damage and defense. Just from a gameplay point of view, it usually makes sense to take your best stuff in multiples, and even with all the factors that balance against that we'll get onto, the majority of competitive lists usually take at least some datasheets in multiples, and several of them will take several things in 3s. I'd say most commonly the reason to spam units is generally for damage and defense type things, say for example Tyranid Exocrines often being fielded in a battery of 3s, perhaps Custodian Wardens coming in multiple squads with Blade Champions, being a general purpose very tanky and scary units. But there can be plenty of other reasons to take more of a datasheet, say a whole bunch of efficient transports to help out other units get up the board, or maybe some utility units like Jump Intercessors or Warp Spiders, which could be good for both skirmishing with the enemy and also doing secondary objectives. They might also get taken in multiples by a bunch of lists. Just for pure unit efficiency, Detachments generally tends to encourage it as opposed to work against it for a bunch of things in 10th edition 40k. In their game design, it feels like Games Workshop's try to use the Detachments to generally make different archetypes of an army viable, maybe often having one general purpose detachment and then many other ones trying to skew to one class of unit within the codex. Say for example, Orcs with their Dread Mob, where all the advantages work around the mechs and the walkers, or Green Tide, where they put a whole bunch of boys on the board and all the stratagems help out them. It's definitely interesting to commit to different themes and then have legitimately different ways to play a faction, but it's definitely something that encourages unit spam as well. As to make those detachments worth it, you need enough units to be worth it to make use of all the synergies of the detachment, as opposed to just going for something more general purpose that can help out all the units. Maybe some other good examples could be things like Space Marine Ironstorm, where it's going to always go heavy on tanks and vehicles, or Guard Hammer of the Emperor, which would do the same, or maybe Tyranid Vanguard going for the Lictor variants and Gene Stealers in big numbers, having efficient use of their stratagems. Between just certain datasheets being good and then some datasheets getting extra good in certain detachments, it does often mean that at the core of the army you might have a couple of trios of units that work just extra well for the strategy that players are trying to use. Another reason to take multiple copies of the same or similar units could be their defensive profiles. This one's been a common theme to Warhammer 40k since some of its early days, just trying to overload the opponent's capacity to deal damage to one class of units, so they don't really have much hope to do anything besides destroy a small section of your army each turn. In 10th edition this feels like it's easiest done with things like tanks, monsters, or maybe super elite infantry. Say if your opponent's got only enough firepower in their army to take down, say, 1 or 2 tanks per turn, if you turn up with 10, then it means there's just going to be no way that they'll chew through your army in any sort of reasonable time. On top of that, if you come with all the same defensive profile, you might make other ones kind of useless. So if you're using a tank or monster spam army, then it just means that all the anti-infantry things that the opponent brought along might be kind of wasted in this particular game. On the damage front, it does limit enemy choices a little bit as well. There's not quite as much agency of choice when you're trying to damage multiple or very similarly tough tanks or monsters, even if going for a skew list like this can have its own bad reasons, with either counterplay from people playing their units in different ways, or just some lists that might be very effective at killing the one defensive profile that you've brought to the table. This one does tend to be a feature of things like stat check style armies of Warhammer 40k though, things like Knights or Custodies maybe being the most common examples, often just trying to win the game with raw might, big defensive profiles that the opponents can't handle, encouraging you to take a lot of copies of things that are going to be similarly hard to take down. Maybe with those kind of armies and a few others, it's probably worth just noting though that some armies don't really have too much option besides to spam certain units. If you don't have a really big unit roster, then a lot of the time it's going to come down to the same few choices, particularly if a few are more efficient than each other. Maybe Leagues of Votann feel like a fairly obvious one for that. With a pretty small unit roster, you can definitely have at least a fairly balanced force, but you're basically always going to need at least some units in doubles or triples, maybe Sagittor spam being the most common thing that they do at the moment in competitive games, as well as often being sort of stat check style armies. Knights and Custodians both have quite small model ranges as well, and not really a whole load of variety between the different types of units that they can choose. Knights are always going to be a skew list of a whole bunch of big stompy robots, and Custodians, if you're playing with the plastic range at least, are going to have a heavy slant towards tanky golden infantry. Finally, for factors making spam armies better, again particularly for the stat check style ones, they often tend to do better in a more casual gaming environment than a more competitive one. Obviously Custodians and Knights can do well at top levels, and maybe more so now than most of the time, but they often tend to be armies that do a lot better in more casual games or say RTTs than the top ends of grand tournaments, where people are generally trying to have answers to anything that they could come across. In more casual games with average hobbyists, people's lists might not be as optimized to deal with certain amounts of skew towards certain defensive profiles. You might get fewer people using clever tricks like blocking movement or intelligently eking out a score for victory points on the mission to counter mass scary damage dealers. And there's also a chance you might not be playing with quite as effective terrain for 40k, which often means really quite a lot of big line of sight blocking L-shaped ruins these days. On more terrain light tables that you might find a bit more in casual settings, you might not be able to shield your army from harm, so big spam of damage dealers has a better chance to do excessively well. In any case, armies that spam in 40k absolutely can do well at high levels of the game as well. Just for a couple of examples of this from a recent video, here's one Chaos Knight army that just spams a massive amount of War Dog Brigands and Carnivores, fast moving general purpose damage dealers that can handle a lot of what's thrown at them, and they also have good objective control, and are cheap enough to be used for some more expendable purposes as well, and the opponent's met with a whole bunch of medium vehicles that's going to stretch their anti-tank capacity. Here's a recent tournament winning shield host list as well for the Adeptus Custodes that spams out the golden bodies, 3 blade champions leading 3 squads of wardens, and then doubling down with more golden bodies on top of that. That's going to be a force that's going to be very scary to try and contest the mid board against. You're unlikely to be able to kill the squads fast enough, particularly the wardens. The Wardens and Blade Champions are still seemingly being seen as the most valuable thing here, so they're absolutely maxed out, and Custodes units in general are scary enough that they can pretty much take down most things in the game with Martial Qatar and their general purpose Guardian Spear attacks. While there's loads of good reasons to spam out lots of units and take entire armies of similar sort of profiles, there's definitely a lot of stuff in 40k working against doing that though. Usually meaning that even if you are building around a core strategy of a few efficient units making use of a detachment theme, it's often a good idea to support them with a bunch of other stuff. There is quite a lot of stuff nudging armies into taking other units even if they're taken in smaller numbers. Maybe one of the biggest and most obvious are individual unit rules like datasheet rules, where plenty of these in 10th edition just make sense that you get maximal value out of getting one copy of it on the board, and then anything after that is kind of diminishing returns. Some examples could be sticky objectives from Storm Guardians or Intercessors, really handy to have the first one of that to mark your home field, but less valued having tons of units that have it, as you can already get it where it's needed the most. Perhaps focal firepower buffing units such as Incursors for the Space Marines or the Astra Militarum Hellhound. The first one of those tends to be extra valuable because you can put the firepower boost on the single thing that needs it the most, and then the next unit is going to be firing at a second or suboptimal target, and potentially one where most of your guns might have been going towards the first one. It's not that you can't take multiple units of them, but usually the first one is more valuable than the second. Other examples could be things like Return to Reserves, really handy to be having some, but you don't need your entire army to be paying the premium to do that. Maybe command point farming units like Gretchen or Genestealer Cult Acolytes, the first 1 or 2 units having excess value compared with the next. Maybe single-use stratagem things like Captains or the Biologist Putrefier for the Death Guard throwing out some grenades. They're perhaps one of the most obvious examples where you explicitly don't get to use their datasheet rule a second time even if there's 2 models in the army. Or other things like infiltrating units, where just having the one unit can be a really powerful tool to make sure that you've got some control of the mid-board. The opponent can't just scout up to you with something scary, or put infiltrators down to move block your important units turn 1. Overall, loads of examples out there, maybe one final one being the Tyrannid Biovore. Only one unit can farm out those spore mines, so you often see exactly one Biovore in lists for board control and doing certain secondary objectives, having a lot of value on top of being just a nuisance screening unit in your home board. As well as datasheet rules, stratagems and enhancements can also play into that as well. If you've got one super efficient stratagem in your detachment that you think you'd want to use every round, it might make sense just to take the one unit that can use that stratagem well. Say maybe Devastating Wound Flamers on aggressors in Space Marine Firestorm. You can't use that stratagem more than once per battle round, so it makes more sense to maybe just have one of those units to get the most out of it, as opposed to having 2 side by side for maybe redundancy. Enhancements could also incentivize you to take one copy of a unit as well. Maybe the Thief of Secrets for Deathwatch being a nice example there, to take one fighty character to be taken to the next level, maybe something like a Space Marine Judas here. Aside from individual small-scale rules, the actual unit profiles and what they do generally make it a good idea to have units to cover your various different battlefield roles that you'd be fielding for them in 10th edition, units that are generally tailored to have extra value depending on where they are on the board. Perhaps outlying units generally having good value if they're cheap and fast, able to do secondary objectives and screen, but you don't necessarily want to pay for extra damage output there. Maybe similar for things like infiltrators and scouts, where you might want to pay the premium for some units but not everyone. Then various different damage dealers as well. Some units might want to pay the premium for longer range so they can still contribute to the fight or reach out and touch things that the enemies are keeping hidden, as well as some close range damage dealers that are just very efficient at what they do, but have the downside where they might not be able to reach everything in the enemy army, so you might not be able to overcommit to them without diminishing returns. If say your one scary close range unit destroys an enemy unit and then the other one doesn't have anything else to damage, it just feels like it's possible to oversolve one of these elements for your army. Going pure damage in an army is certainly scary, but against a skilled opponent on good terrain you might just lose out on board control or high objective control. If you've got too many cheap scoring units, then it might just be redundant in that you already had enough to screen the enemy and to score objectives, and it might just mean that you're more at risk of your army being wiped out by an army that's gone heavier on damage than you. And too many focal or synergy units might leave your army with low defensive stat lines and have the risk of having a bunch of buffing units that very rapidly have nothing much to buff if the opponent can deal some meaningful damage to your battle line. As well as positions on the board, you need different units that can damage different enemy profiles. Given the sort of skew list that you might come across, ideally you need something that can destroy enemy tanks, destroy enemy hordes, or mass armies of elite infantry. Some units can be very general purpose and are pretty good against all of them, but a lot of the time you might just have things that are great at their specialised niche, like some Eldari Fire Dragons perhaps, but not exactly what you want against other targets. This could definitely still be consistent with unit spam though, say taking 3 anti-tank units next to 3 anti-infantry style units, so I guess contributes to having an army that's a bit more varied. Otherwise, for a few more specific factors, epic heroes can be one. You can only take one of those, and sometimes by taking one of those you incentivize yourself to take another unit that you might not have taken otherwise. Say for example Marnius Calgar of the Ultramarines, he would want a guard to run with, and that might be something like company heroes or even some blade guard or eradicators or something. A unit that you might not have taken unless you had a big powerful character with lots of buffs to lead them. Armies with a good amount of variety going on might be a bit less easy to counter as well. Sometimes full-on spam lists can be very obvious about what they're going to do. It's not always the worst thing in the world if they're going to be very hard to stop doing what they're going to do, but maybe do open up the possibility of counterplay to them at least a fair bit. Say if your opponent's got nothing but tanks, you might wind up getting them move blocks or outscored with your objective control style units and might be able to grind out a painful victory. Or if you went all melee or all ranged units, then the army's going to have fewer choices. For example, if you've got no ranged threats, then the opponent doesn't actually have to bother hiding units. Or if you've got no melee threats, then it can just make sense to rush the enemy as fast as possible, or make maximal use of hiding behind terrain, as you know that they need lines of sight to be able to damage you with anything. On top of that, certain army lists might counter them. Say if you've gone for a skew list that's really heavy in Terminator equivalents, if you run into an enemy army that's got a massive amount of sort of anti-elite damage 3 shooting, you might be in for a bad time as opposed to something a bit more balanced. I did mention earlier about spam lists often wanting to have one defensive profile, things like Knights and Custodians that can happily stand out in the open and take punishment while giving it out themselves. I would say in 9th and 10th edition though, that's generally less important than maybe in previous editions of 40k, just due to the way that things like terrain and reserves work. Making sure that elements of the army can hide behind terrain before jumping out to strike the opponent, so at least get some value out of them, and you don't have to have your entire army being able to weather an enemy shooting phase out in the open. Compared with the past, it means that armies can be really quite fragile a lot more viably than they would be able to if the whole board might well be a shooting gallery, maybe fragile infantry forces such as Footdar Eldari, or mixed forces with a few heavy targets but a bunch of lighter infantry as well aren't such a liability as previously. Though as mentioned, it still tends to be helpful if you can overload the opponent's damage output. There is a chance in 40k as well that with the lethality of the game at the moment, overloading certain armies' damage output might just be unlikely to happen full stop. Maybe Horde armies being a good example of that at the moment. They aren't quite so common in 10th edition, at least partly due to the fairly obscene amount of anti-infantry firepower a lot of armies can do just kind of incidentally. And even if you take things to silly numbers like say putting 250 plus guardsmen on the board, your opponent could very easily still have enough shots to wipe them out over 5 turns. Finally, for some of the reasons against spam, certain secondary objectives might punish them. You might make it more valid to take fixed secondaries, things like bring it down or assassinate or call the horde against certain armies. If you do make it incredibly easy for them to wipe out certain styles of units, I feel like these really tend to wax and wane with how important they are from one mission pack to the next. We certainly had lots of different versions of them back in 9th edition and already have had 2 mission packs in 10th with presumably a 3rd one on the way. Bring it down doesn't tend to be the worst incentive not to go for loads of tank or monster spam at the moment, but that might not always be the case. Finally, for a few more thoughts beyond gameplay, I feel like usually when collecting a Warhammer army, the better tactic tends to be not to go absolutely all in on one unit class, given how often the game updates and changes. You certainly can chase the meta and buy 3 copies of each hot meta thing, but there's a good chance that if that unit is really quite strong, Games Workshop's just going to nerf it in the next balance update, and then you might have an army that's just not really very viable unless you rush out to buy more stuff, as opposed to the collector that maybe bought a whole bunch of different units so they've got lots of flexibility. It usually just means that for long-term value for a collection, there's more chance that 1 copy of each unit is probably going to get played as opposed to 3 of 1, as that's only going to matter in the games where you absolutely all-out spam that unit, which definitely could happen a lot of the time. But if that unit gets nerfed and it's not powerful anymore, then it could be a really bad idea. Maybe one example of that was Invicta Tactical Warsuits when they released. They were really quite powerful when they came out, and lots of people were running 3 of them, but now that's not really the case anymore as game and meta things have moved on. For a more sort of interest of gameplay style thing as well, generally people tend to prefer the interest of mixed armies, maybe promoting a few more interesting unit interactions as opposed to just trying to cut down the same tanks and vehicles. Though admittedly for certain armies a good amount of spam can be fun and fluffy as well. Say if you're going in for an Orc Dread mob, then I think most people would be expecting you to put a whole bunch of tanky walkers on the board. That's far from the strongest Orc build right now. Spamming out a bunch of units doesn't necessarily have to be a particularly powerful thing on the tabletop if those units aren't standout strong. In any case, here's just one example of an army that used a fair amount of different units, again from a recent video, and this one's John Lennon's list that went undefeated at a recent tournament after the balanced data slate. There's a couple of good Ultramarines epic heroes here, a bunch of skirmish units filling out their own battlefield roles, one big centerpiece with a Storm Raven playing around with some Assault Centurions, and then the only doubled up units are a couple of Ballistas Dreadnoughts and a pair of Stormspeeder Hammer Strikes. I feel like you wouldn't really lose too much value by swapping out one Ballistas for something different really, and if anything running 2 Hammer Strikes is kind of unusual in competitive lists due to doubling down on the ignores cover benefit. You far more often just tend to see people running exactly one of those. Space Marines do tend to be an army where running a whole bunch of different things is quite viable though, just with the vast amount of unit options that they have to put on the table. In any case, for some overall thoughts, usually optimised lists tend to take some amount of unit spam, usually some units in the codex just tend to be a bit more efficient than others, and then certain unit focused detachments tend to exacerbate that even more. For some armies it can be really quite viable to field a whole bunch of different units and embrace the advantages of having a bunch of different datasheet rules, different things that you can do tactically, and having lots of options that are kind of similarly efficient. Some armies are maybe a bit more limited if they want to field a strong army list and do that, needing to rely on certain datasheets, and maybe particularly for the more stat check style armies out there like Knights and Custodians and friends, particularly reliant on spamming out lots of one defensive profile, even if it might be across multiple datasheets. In general though, besides just a few exceptions, it almost always makes sense to have some sort of balance between spamming out your best units and taking a bunch of other things that work better as one-offs for one reason or another. Focal character combos, datasheet rules, certain stratagems or enhancements, covering multiple battlefield roles that have diminishing returns like infiltrators or objective grabbing type things, plus making sure the army is not quite as easily hard countered by things, and giving you different things that you can do with gameplay strategy, as opposed to having a really predictable army that the opponent knows exactly what it's going to do. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below though. Do your armies tend to be made up of a lot of the same units with lots of copies of the same thing, or do you tend to go for a whole variety of stuff? I'll leave this one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts, and feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out each day. If you'd like to help support the channel and keep the videos coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.